Hi, my name is Francesca Polletta. I'm a sociologist and I study social movements. I study the civil rights movement, the women's movement, global justice movements, the environmental movement, and the movement against climate change. All of these are organized efforts on the part of a lot of people to make changes in laws, policies, practices, using at least in part unconventional political means, rather than voting or lobbying legislators, protesting, marching, demonstrating, boycotting, petitioning. I think I want to talk about some of the misconceptions that people often have about social movements. Misconceptions about why they emerge when they do, why people participate in them, and when they're effective. I want to draw attention to some of the research that's come out of recent scholarship in response to those questions and draw some lessons about how we might build a stronger movement against climate change. I want to say from the outset there is a lot that we don't know, that making social change is complicated and difficult. Many of the suggestions I'm going to make are old hat to activists. Still, I think it's worthwhile to try to pit the reality of making social change against some of the myths that we often have about it. So the first misconception I want to talk about is that movements emerge when people are so frustrated they cannot not act. This belief, like the others that I'm going to talk about, makes sense. We often think about protest as a kind of eruption of discontent when people can't bear the status quo any longer and feel themselves compelled to act against it. We think of Rosa Parks, the Montgomery, Alabama resident who was too tired to stand up on the segregated bus one day, was arrested. And her arrest prompted the Montgomery bus boycott, where most of Montgomery's Black residents stayed off the city buses for a year until segregated busing was declared to be unconstitutional. Now, the reality is, in fact, Rosa Parks was a longtime civil rights activist rather than someone who was just too tired to stand up on the bus that day. She was the secretary of the local chapter of her NAACP. The NAACP had been considering a bus boycott for some time. They had considered launching one after the arrest of a young woman named Claudette Colvin. Colvin, however, was 15 years old, pregnant, and unmarried. And the NAACP decided strategically that it made more sense to go with someone like Rosa Parks, who was middle-aged, middle class, a pillar of the community. But the point I want to make is both that this decision was strategic and that in this case, as in most cases, movements rarely come out of nowhere. There are almost always activists operating, often under the radar, long before protests burst onto the scene, who are looking for what scholars call political openings or political opportunities for protests to have an impact. So they look for changes, especially in the political system, when they believe that decision makers are vulnerable to protest, are open to protest for some reason. What are political openings? Often elections, pending legislation, but also when an issue is in the public eye. Sometimes when there has been what scholars call a moral shock. 3 Mile Island, for example, figured as a kind of moral shock that allowed the anti-nuclear movement to mobilize people and demand change in a way that it hadn't done before. The stimulus package was a kind of political opening for the Tea Party movement. In some ways, the Supreme Court Dobbs decision has been a political opening for the reproductive rights movement, not in the sense that it was good for reproductive rights, but it created opportunities to mobilize people in a way that could lead to real change. Now, I want to emphasize that political openings take diverse forms, and that the kinds of protests that it makes sense to launch in the context of those opportunities also take diverse forms. Let me give you two examples. Some of you may remember the protests against Nike and other leading brands for operating sweatshops and for violating environmental standards. People came out into the streets, often students, mobilized against these companies. And they did so not because at this moment they were so frustrated by what they were learning about companies' practices, but rather because at this moment companies had become really concerned about the visibility and the reputation of their brands. When I was a kid, you bought whichever sneakers were cheapest. That no longer by the 90s had become the case. Brands had become incredibly important to consumers, and the performance of the company that had that brand became important too. And so activists realized that if they could get people to protest against these large manufacturers, they had a chance of winning, precisely because of that change in companies' bottom line. A study by Dixon and colleagues in 2016 found that companies were most likely to actually make changes in labor practices and environmental practices in response to the protests, either when the protests received wide media coverage and or when the protests were combined with the threat of government action. And this is a point that I'm going to come back to a number of times, is that often for protests to have an impact, several things have to happen at once. Not only media coverage in addition to protests, but also the possibility often of government taking a stand. Here's another example, which I think points to the diverse kinds of protests that can be effective in taking advantage of new openings. In 2010, a film called Gasland was made. It was about fracking. And after the film was released, environmental groups around the country organized screenings of the film, and often did so in conjunction with discussions of the issue and sometimes demonstrations around fracking. A study by Vasey et al. In 2015 found that local bans on fracking, so they looked at where bans were passed on fracking, and they found that those bans were more likely to be passed in places where environmental groups had organized than in places where water was most contaminated from fracking. So again, an example of how activists were able to identify a political opening, mobilize around it, and make change. And so I think the key that I take from this is that movements need always to be attentive to, alert to political openings for protests, diverse kinds of political openings and diverse kinds of protest to have an impact. Second misconception is that people only participate in movements. They only join protests when they really believe in the cause. Again, this makes sense. Right? Protest is time-consuming. It's difficult. It takes energy. Sometimes it's risky. Why would you participate if you didn't believe strongly in the cause? What the research suggests, though, is that people participate not when they believe most strongly in the cause, but when someone whom they know, like, and respect asks them to participate. It's those bonds of pre-existing bonds of respect and affection that lead people to do something. You participate because your friends are participating. You participate because your minister or rabbi says that this is a worthy cause and asks you to participate. You participate because the person at your workplace tells you that this is a good thing to do. And so one of the clear findings that has come out of movement studies is that pre-existing networks of friendship, church networks, workplace networks, club networks, matter enormously to movement participation. That movement groups are well served by trying to access those networks. It's much more effective as an activist for me to try to organize and work with these networks and the people who lead these networks than it is for me to just try to buttonhole you on the street. Now, what about social media? Right? That's another kind of virtual network. And one of the questions that movement scholars wrestle with is whether social media can be a kind of substitute for these pre-existing networks in bringing people to the movement. And there's a lot of debate again, but I think the consensus is that social media can bring people into movements when the action they're being asked to take is easy, like signing a petition, and when the action that they're asked to take is one time rather than sustained. When it comes to getting people involved for the longer haul, it seems really important to either access those pre-existing networks or to build them. And I think this is the important thing, that it's the bonds that people have with each other that leads them to join the movement, and that also keeps them in the movement, rather than pre-existing beliefs leading to participation. We know that in some cases, people participate in a movement before they have strong beliefs about the cause. And that participation and the social ties they forge in and through the participation gets them to pay more attention to the cause and to believe in it. And so the key then is to build on people's existing relationships and recruiting them to movements. And then I'll talk more about this later, to build new movement-based relationships, right? If you want to keep people participating for the long haul, which is pretty much essential for movements, you need to build ties within the movement. Let me talk about a third misconception. I'll spend a little bit more time on this one. And this one is that movements are effective. They make change by changing people's hearts and minds. Again, a reasonable belief. Right? Think about the movement for gay and lesbian rights. It wasn't too long ago that homosexuality was widely viewed by Americans as a perversion, as sinful. Today, most Americans believe that gay men and lesbians should have the right to work where they want, to marry whom they want, to have the families they want. What accounts for that change? Well, in part the fact that many straight Americans began to learn that people they knew and loved and respected were gay or lesbian. Right? Knowing someone changed their minds. And so it makes a lot of sense to think that if we want to change people's beliefs and practices and policies around climate change, we need to change hearts and minds. I want to suggest, though, that in many cases of movement impact, changing hearts and minds may not be necessary, and that changing hearts and minds may not be enough to secure the kinds of changes we want. So first, go back to the anti-sweatshop protests that I mentioned a moment ago. It is possible that some of the people within companies, within these manufacturing giants, agreed to make labor and environmental changes because they really had become true believers in the cause. But I suspect that many more were willing to make those changes, not because they had become ideologically committed to labor rights or environmental standards, but because they feared the loss of profit if their brand suffered, because they feared the costs that would come with potential government regulation, because they feared the sanctions that would come from investors or financial raiders if those government regulations were passed. Now, none of these things were certain. It's not certain that government regulation would be passed. It's not certain that the brand would suffer. But what I want to emphasize here is the importance of that unpredictability for companies. It is often unclear what will generate profit and what will threaten profit. And so for companies whose bottom line is profit, the actions they should take are often unclear. What organizational scholars have found is that what companies tend to do in that context of uncertainty is to imitate organizations that are seen as being on the cutting edge. In other words, they want to get out in front of what may be a required change by doing what other companies who are seen as leaders are already doing. What that means for movements is that there may be ways to convince companies and other organizations that making the kind of change they want is innovative rather than risky, is sensible rather than ideological. Let me give you another example from wind energy. Today, at a time when we know that political partisanship is the strongest predictor of environmental attitudes, right? Partisan polarization has increased to the extent that whether you consider yourself an environmentalist largely depends on whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Even in this context, 4 red states, Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Kansas, are the highest producers of the nation's energy. Wind energy has become profitable. It has come to make financial sense. A lot of things had to change for that to happen. It wasn't just the environmental movement. Anti-nuclear activists were key, especially in Europe, in developing the first wind turbines. Activists pressured the government to provide incentives for companies to invest in wind energy. Activists also lobbied and worked with major organizations, universities, and companies to purchase wind energy. And critically, one of the arguments that they often made when they were meeting with companies, and that people in companies said was very influential, was that other companies viewed as on the cutting edge, were also buying wind energy. And so the point that I would make is simply that movements need to target the government and for-profit institutions. They need to challenge the powers that be, but they also need to work with them. And by working with them, I mean not just trying to change their views of climate change, but to make the case that acting on climate change now is innovative rather than risky. Capitalizing on the kind of uncertainty about what makes for profits or threatens profits by convincing companies that they can be ahead of the curve rather than engaging in something really risky. Second point I want to make again is that changing minds may not be enough. Americans overwhelmingly believe now that climate change exists, that it's human caused, and that the government needs to act against climate change. This is a recent poll showing that 70% of Americans favor the US government taking steps to try to reduce climate change. So they believe in climate change and they believe the government has to act, but they don't vote that way. And in this respect, I think it's interesting to compare the climate change movement, the anti-climate change movement, with the gun rights movement. The gun rights movement has been very successful in the United States, and people often think that it's because the National Rifle Association, the NRA, has a lot of money. In fact, it doesn't have that much money. What the NRA does have, though, is a membership that is highly attuned to politics and willing to vote on the basis of their views of gun rights. And so the NRA has educated their membership about which candidates are supportive of gun rights and has made candidates keenly aware that NRA members will not vote for them unless they not only profess their commitment to gun rights, but show what they've done lately with respect to gun rights. And so I think the lesson here for the environmental movement and the movement against climate change more broadly is, first, as I said, that we need to make action on climate change seem innovative rather than risky to companies. And we need to make it seem of overriding political importance to voters. We need to make a collective identity of environmentalist seem so important to voters that that's what they have uppermost in their mind when they're voting for a candidate, that it's more important to them than what that candidate's stance is on taxes or on foreign policy or on anything else. Now, how do we do that? And I want to talk briefly here about a kind of common solution that's proposed. Maybe the way we can get people to feel and act on a strong environmental identity is to encourage them to take action, to engage in environmental behavior. And so maybe movements are effective when they not only change people's hearts and minds, but change their behavior in relation to the issue. And so you often hear environmental organizations making the case for small steps, for easy actions, telling us what we can do to stop climate change. The argument that proponents of these small actions make is not just that if I stop using plastic bags, that's going to save the planet. It's not just that my buying an environmental vehicle is going to stop global warming. Instead, the argument is that my making an individual lifestyle change, like stopping using plastic bags or composting or buying low energy light bulbs, that my making that easy individual lifestyle change should lead me to make more changes. Should lead me then to think about bicycling to work, should lead me to think about not taking flights for vacations and so on. It may lead other people to make changes. If my neighbors see me composting, then they may feel compelled to begin composting themselves. And then my taking individual lifestyle change should also lead me and my neighbors and friends to recognize that individual action is not enough, right? That government action is also necessary. That's the argument. Now, does it work? The jury's still out. Some studies have found that when people take one action, they take more action. Other studies have found something that they refer to as moral licensing. So if I buy an electric car, I feel like I've done my part and I can stop my refrigerator with plastic bottles. Some studies have found that people are more likely to see government action as necessary when they make individual change. Others have found that people see government as less necessary because they begin to think, well, if everyone just makes the kind of voluntary changes I'm making, then why do we need government action at all? So the jury is still out. Two meta-analytic studies, that is, studies that reviewed a number of studies that had been done, concluded that taking individual environmental action led to an increase in the intent to take further action, but had no effect on actual behavior. So when people took an easy environmental action, it made them want to do more, but it did not lead them to do more. Nor did it seem to have any impact on their support for government action. Critics have argued that contemporary environmental organizations encourage people only to consume differently. And they say that's no solution, actually, to the crisis of climate change. I would argue that that's not the problem. If you look at any environmental website, any of the leading organizations, you will see that there's a tab invariably saying take action. And visitors to the site are encouraged to sign petitions, to call their congressional representatives, to take political action rather than only consuming differently. So I would argue that's not the problem. The problem, I would argue, is that people are often encouraged to take action without much follow-up, right? So you go onto that website, you call your congressional representative. What happens next? As I said, for movements to be effective, they need participants to turn up and then to turn up over and over again, to become engaged in more sustained, more demanding action. And so I would argue that the lesson here is not that we need to encourage people to engage in more political action. I think environmental organizations are already doing that. But we need to find ways to give people the opportunity to deepen their involvement in the movement. And again, I would argue that those social networks, those solidary ties, being a member of a chapter organization, a chapter where you know other people, where you see them, where you come up with actions together, where you have a sense of accountability to each other, that's really crucial, not only to movement participation, but to movement success. So let me conclude simply by saying that none of this is easy. Perhaps that is the biggest misconception of all, that social change is easy to make. It is not. But I take from the movement scholarship the idea that movements need to be deliberate and fast acting. They need to be alert to the kinds of signals that suggest that protest can have an impact in diverse ways. Movements need to be fun and demanding. Right? People may not need to have a raised political consciousness to participate in a movement. They may simply participate because their friends are participating, and that's okay. Once they're in the movement, though, we need to find ways to make their participation an obligation to them and to make it demanding. And then finally, I take from the scholarship that movements are often effective when they target both government and every other institution that has the capacity to change the way we live and work. It's not either or, either government or voluntary action, either government or companies taking action. I think we see that impact often happens when all of those are operating at once. Thank you.